Hey everyone, Dan here, and for those of you not up to date with the lore of myself and my channel, I live in the D.C. suburbs in Maryland, and I've lived here for about 2.5 years. But before this, I actually lived in the state of Wyoming for 23 years, where I was born and raised. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about my experience living in both areas of the US, as well as comparing and contrasting them. And it's pretty interesting because both the DC area and Wyoming are about as different from each other as you can get without leaving the United States. There are many factors influencing this, such as different cultural groups, politics, population density, among many others. Before I get started, you may notice I sound a little bit different than usual. I'm currently recovering from COVID-19, so my voice is not all the way back yet, so I may sound a little sick. That's because I am a little sick. So, for some background, I was born and raised in a small town in Wyoming called Gillette, with a population of 33,000 people. Despite this, it was still the fourth largest town in the state. Gillette is a coal town responsible for 40% of the country's coal. That's more coal coming from this one town than the entire state of West Virginia, which is typically seen as being the coal state. It's not. Wyoming is the coal state. Oh, and for the train foamers watching, here's a cool map of freight rail tonnage. You see that area where the line is insanely thick and where it ends? That's Gillette. All those trains are carrying coal. Virtually everybody in my immediate family has worked for the coal mine companies in some capacity, whether it be literally taking shovel trucks down in the coal mine pits or just working bureaucratic office jobs. And the town is incredibly reliant on it, to a fault. When the coal industry goes on a downturn, the entire economy of the town takes a downturn, and it's not somewhere I found myself being able to build a stable career. So, when I turned 19, I moved to Casper, the second largest town in the state of Wyoming. Now, Casper is also fairly reliant on fossil fuel jobs, this time being oil, but its economy is a good deal more diversified, so I saw more of a future for myself there. But my options were still limited, and I'm not a huge fan of the rural lifestyle, so I still wanted to get out once I had the opportunity, but I did feel a lot more comfortable there. So the plan was from here, I was going to save up some money and move to Denver, which was the nearest major city. It's still like a 5-hour drive, but there's not really any other major cities nearby. However, whenever I was almost done saving up money to move to Denver, I had an odd opportunity come by. I had a friend of mine going to university in Washington, D.C. recently have a dramatic breakup with his landlord and roommate and needed someone to come pay half of his rent. I decided to take the opportunity and moved to D.C. instead of Denver. Now, I know some of the DMV residents are already mad at me for my terminology here. Yes, I acknowledge the Maryland suburbs do not equal DC, but people outside the DMV don't know what DMV means. So just calling the entire region DC makes sense in the same way that calling Long Beach, Los Angeles, or New Rochelle, New York makes sense. And for additional context, I work in Northern Virginia and I do a good deal of my recreation in the district proper. But for the rest of this video, I will be referring to the entire region as the DMV, mostly just for the sake of clarification. And for those of you who don't know, DMV is an acronym standing for District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia. It's a particularly useful term because this one city spreads across 3 different states, and all 3 of those states have really strong identities and will get mad if you use them incorrectly. So when I moved to the DMV, I briefly lived in Germantown before settling down in Greenbelt. When that apartment turned out to be a dump, I moved to College Park. Where am I now? Wouldn't you like to know? Now that that background is out of the way, let's start the comparison. These points will be in no particular order. Difference number 1, population. The entire state of Wyoming has 587,000 people. Not to mention, Casper and the rest of Natrona County only has 80,000. The DMV has 6.3 million. Yeah, so the DMV's population is about 80 times that of Casper. And I had basically no experience living in cities before this. I had traveled to Denver and Orlando a few times, but that was really about it. I did some research coming in, so I wasn't completely blindsided, but there were a lot of things I needed to get used to. Difference number 2, cost of living. The cost of living in Wyoming is overall cheaper, but it's complicated. I had a modest 2-bedroom apartment to myself for about $750 a month. I ended up getting a roommate, not because I really needed one, but just because I had an extra bedroom and would rather put that extra money towards saving to leave the state, which I did. Compare this to the DMV, where I currently pay about $860 of rent for a 3-bedroom apartment that I share with 2 roommates. It totals about $2,600 just split 3 ways. However, I do want to point out that because of the isolation of the communities in Wyoming, things like food and healthcare tend to be more expensive there. It's also worth mentioning that even though wages are higher in DC, I think that whenever you take the ratio of income to like rent pricing, I think Wyoming still comes out on top. Difference number 3, healthcare. Healthcare in rural America is notoriously atrocious. especially in the really isolated rural areas like Montana, Wyoming, and Alaska. It's basically impossible to get reliable specialized healthcare in the state. While there are a few specialists, they tend to be one specialist serving basically the entire state. So for instance, it'll be one doctor serving Gillette on Monday and Casper on Tuesdays, for example. Even then, there's still a big lack of choice. So because of this, people needing specialized healthcare tend to go out of state, most of the time to Billings, Rapid City, Denver, or Salt Lake City. Compare this to Washington, D.C. with world-class medical research universities and reliable hospitals, as well as so many specific specialists that even just going up to Baltimore for treatment sounds like you're going really far. Oh, there's also the fact that 95% of DC is fully vaccinated for COVID-19, where it's only 55% in Wyoming. Difference number 4, the job market. I already talked about this a little bit, but the job market in these two areas are dramatically different. Typically, towns in Wyoming will be built around one industry. Gillette has coal, Casper has oil, Cody and Jackson have tourism, and Laramie has the university. Compare this to the DMV, where the economy is dramatically diversified. Of course, there's the obvious employer that is the federal government, but there's a lot more than just that. You have military, tech, finance, corporate retail and logistics, healthcare, tourism, education, medical research, you name it. DC has a little bit of everything. Difference number 5, education. So you may have heard a moment ago, I was talking about how Laramie, Wyoming, its job market is reliant on the university. The university, as in the only university in the state of Wyoming. While some community colleges do offer a limited variety of 4-year degrees, for the most part, if you need a bachelor's degree or better, you have to go to the University of Wyoming or go out of state. Compare this to the DMV, where you have UMD, UMDGC, Howard, Virginia Tech, George Mason, George Washington, UDC, American, Georgetown, Gallaudet, Catholic University of America, and many more. The percent of people in Washington, D.C. with a bachelor's degree or better is 63%, and that's the highest in the country. Compare this to Wyoming, where that percent is 29%. Though I do want to point out, I think it's easier to make a solid living in Wyoming without a college degree due to the abundance of high-paying fossil fuel jobs. Difference number 6, politics. Wyoming and D.C. are polar opposites whenever it comes to politics. Wyoming, by many counts, is the single most conservative state in the country, though sometimes it does flip around with either Mississippi or Oklahoma. Whereas D.C. regularly ranks as the most democratic state in the country, with Maryland also ranking pretty high up there, as well as Northern Virginia, though the rest of Virginia is considerably more purple. And yeah, you can extrapolate that exactly what you think. Wyoming has a lot of people who think that this was okay. Oh, and would you look at that? There goes my subscriber count. That's fine. Good riddance. I didn't want him around anyways. If you couldn't tell, I disagree with most of the politics in Wyoming. I feel a lot more at home with the politics in the DMV. Difference number 7, cultural diversity. Obligatory, I am very white, and Wyoming is overwhelmingly white. There is a noticeable minority of Latinos, but the state is overall very white. It's a pretty solid monoculture across the entire state of rural conservative Americans. They like hunting, fishing, trucks, horses, rodeos. Basically, the stereotypes are true. Compare this to the DMV. The District of Columbia is a historically black city, as is Prince George's County in Maryland. But there's a mix of everyone from everywhere here. There's still very large populations of Salvadoreños, whites, Arabs, and those are just the ones I can think of the really large presence off the top of my head. There's a little bit of every group here. Though I will say there are actually 2 culturally distinct groups that I do see a lot more in Wyoming than I do in the DMV, and that's the Mormons and Native Americans. I remember whenever I worked in Germantown and Alexandria that about 3/4 of my coworkers could speak Spanish, and a lot of them weren't even Latino, they just knew Spanish. Now compare this to whenever I lived in Wyoming. And well, mi español no es muy bien, pero esto es mejor que incomparable a mis otros trabajadores. And if my Spanish there was so bad that you don't know what I just said, that kind of proves my point. Difference number 8, transportation and urban planning. I'm going to geek out on this one a little bit because that's kind of my interest and the main thing I talk about on this channel. Okay, first, let's get the big one out of the way. Traffic in the DMV is considerably worse than it is in Wyoming. DC was recently ranked as the city with the worst traffic in the US, whereas in Wyoming, I can think of 3 intersections in the entire state that would even count as having traffic. The DMV overall is much denser than any town in Wyoming, with taller buildings, more compact urban cores, and more walkable and bikeable streets. While Wyoming does have some pockets of walkable areas, many of which are incredibly nice, Sheridan, for instance, incredible downtown area. Overall, the towns are built to be very car-centric, and have very low-density housing, with pretty much everything built as single-family homes. Likewise, towns in Wyoming either have no public transit or public transit so bad that the only people that take them are those with no other option. Gillette only has paratransit, and Casper's system is so bad that I'm not even offended that Google Maps doesn't show it. Compare this to the DMV, where I lived car-free pretty much on accident for so long that my car battery died and I had to get it jumped and charged. And I was even in a more suburban area. This is because of public transportation in the DMV actually works. As much as I complain about it, it works. And the DMV has a lot more in the way of denser mixed-use communities. Of course, it doesn't help that I also just don't like driving, so I tend not to if I can help it. I didn't even live near where I worked. I just took Metro to work. Difference number 9, weather. DC is hot and humid and built on a literal swamp. This took a little bit for me to get used to it, but it actually wasn't as big of an adjustment as I thought it was going to be. But overall, DC summers are a lot more sweltering and miserable than probably anything in Wyoming. That being said, I would much rather put up with the DC summer than a Wyoming winter. Wyoming has some of the most brutal winters in the country. For most of the state, you can reliably see snow every month of the year except for June, July, and August. Even then, there are some pockets of the state that get snow year-round. And from November to April, the temperature regularly goes below zero. Sometimes well below zero, with a wind chill of -40 being very common in December through February. But people here are just built for this. They don't even cancel school unless the school buses literally don't start. So from a very young age, the kids are trained to just be used to the cold weather. But yeah, the winters in Wyoming are incredibly miserable, and I don't miss them one bit. Now I'm going to go over some smaller differences that I've noticed. Kitchen sinks in the DMV tend to have one large basin as opposed to 2 smaller basins. I think this has to do with the fact that houses in the DMV tend to be older, and people are just used to older houses having one basin, so even the newer houses get built that way. Whereas houses in Wyoming tend to be a lot newer, and a lot of them are mobile or modular homes, which almost anywhere in the country will come with double basin sinks. Grocery stores in the DMV are more likely to use paper bags, they're more likely to encourage customers to bag their own groceries, and have locks on the shopping carts that prevent you from taking them outside the lot. I do want to bring up, part of that might be the fact that I tend to shop at Aldi and Lidl, which don't exist in Wyoming. Whereas in Wyoming, I tried bringing my own reusable shopping bags once, and they were confused and didn't know what to do with them. Central AC is pretty much a requirement everywhere in the DMV, even the cheap apartments have it. It's really just a luxury in Wyoming, though. The DMV is littered with these sketchy little gas stations that also double as like an auto repair shop. These do not exist in Wyoming, like at all. I've literally never seen one. The DMV has a lot more trees, at least compared to eastern Wyoming where I grew up. Western Wyoming has trees. Eastern, not really. Well, at least there's no natural trees. So overall, for me, I think the DMV was a better pick, and I don't really regret moving. There are some things I miss, mostly the cost of living as well as friends and family. But overall, I don't regret moving. That's all the major differences between Wyoming and the DMV I wanted to go over today. If you want to see a part 2 where I go over more differences, let me know what differences you want me to talk about in the comments below. I'm definitely open to that. If you want to see more, there's a red button down there somewhere that'll help you with that. And you should especially click that if you're into public transportation or urbanism. Hold on, I forgot one important difference. Unlike Washington, D.C., Wyoming doesn't actually exist.